Hello everyone, welcome to my rant about the pandemic. The reason I'm doing this is because I think the public debate has gone completely off the rails, especially in the last month or so. And I would like to discuss an exit strategy which has, for the most part, been sidelined in the public debate, bafflingly so. I would like to explain why I think it's the only viable alternative. And then I'd also like to discuss the reasons why we've gotten to this point. By this point, I mean a situation where most Western governments have converged on so-called exit strategies that will ultimately lead to complete catastrophe if they are consistently pursued. I'd also like to talk a bit about the philosophical assumptions that are informing a lot of these political decisions, or that are at least making these political decisions possible. The public mindset that is accommodating these moves, talk about the psychology of it, and then discuss the economic consequences of where we're going, the political and social consequences of where we're going, and ultimately how we got to this point in terms of the debate. So before I get into all of that, let me just quickly say a few things by way of qualification so that I'm not misunderstood, my motivation isn't misconstrued. The virus is a serious one, and it is real. It's not a hoax. It's not a pandemic. It has nothing to do with 5G. All of those are patently absurd positions that no serious person should listen to or give the time of day. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to assume, if you're listening to this, that you are relatively sane, and I'll be speaking to you as if that were the case. The virus, as I said, is serious, it's real, it is significantly worse than seasonal flu. So again, if you think that it's just the same thing as a seasonal flu, I suggest you go and actually look at the latest research on this. And also I would say that if you just look at the empirical evidence, for example, what happened in Italy and Spain, you'll see that this is qualitatively different from the seasonal flu. And if you're willing to turn a blind eye to those things, again, you're just beyond the pale, and I won't be addressing myself to such people. However, the virus is significantly less dangerous than we initially feared, thankfully. So the infection fatality rate is not as high as we thought it might be initially. The case fatality rate is also not as high as we thought initially. And this is the average case fatality rate, the average infection fatality rate internationally. Of course, it does depend to a great extent on the environment, on demographic factors, what the case and infection fatality rates will be in any given country. But the averages are converging towards, in the case of the infection fatality rate, something around 0.5% to 1% is my understanding of the latest data. And the case fatality rate still, understandably, is higher than that, ranging in and around, I think, 3% to 5%, although maybe a little bit off on that. But in any case, the most important indicator there is the infection fatality rate, which is essentially the real fatality rate for the virus, and it is around 0.5% to 1%, which remains significantly higher than seasonal flu, for example. And so it is much more serious, and we need to think carefully about how we're going to deal with it until such time as we have a vaccine, assuming we ever get a vaccine. So that's enough about the virus itself. There still remains a lot that is unknown. For example, there are indications that many people suffer from symptoms for a much longer period than is typical for example, the flu or other coronaviruses. And so that needs to be investigated further. There remain uncertainties, for example, about the role that children play in terms of spreading the disease. But all indications are that children are one of the least vulnerable groups when it comes to critical versions of the illness. So that's a relief. And there has also been some controversy about the issue of immunity, that is to say, post-infection immunity. And some people have claimed that the virus does not demonstrate any post-infection immunity. Once someone has been infected and recovers, people claim that there is no evidence that they are then immune to reinfection. But that was based on, to a large extent, false positives that were returned in South Korea. There was a scare story initially about that some people who had recovered became reinfected, but it has since been discovered that those were false positives. The tests picked up dead virus fragments in the bloodstream or the mucus sample. I can't remember what kind of test it was, but in any case, thankfully and mercifully, those turned out to be false positives, and it's looking increasingly likely that having been infected and recovered, you will have some significant immunity to reinfection, at least for a considerable period of time, perhaps at least half a year to a year, and that would be sufficient to be able to achieve some kind of collective or herd immunity eventually, whether by vaccine or by natural means. So that's a relief. In any case, I want to get first to what I think is the only viable exit strategy from the current situation. So with respect to the lockdowns, I can completely understand why governments, especially in Europe after seeing what was happening in Italy, decided to enter lockdowns, close down most of the economy and society, and require people to stay home. That was perfectly understandable given the degree of uncertainty that we were facing, given the evidence that was coming in from Italy, and the fact that their health system essentially collapsed in places because of the virus. That lockdown approach initially, that as an emergency measure, was understandable in order to give governments enough breathing space to assess the situation and to come up with a viable exit strategy or long-term way of handling the virus. And as more data came in, the governments could then formulate a more nuanced approach. Unfortunately, in my opinion, they have failed to do so. They have failed to come up with anything that looks like a viable exit strategy from the lockdown situation. So they've backed themselves into a corner, initially understandably, but now have essentially consigned themselves to that corner for the foreseeable future because of a completely irrational assessment of the risks, that is to say, the entire range of risks, all things considered risks. They've failed to make adequate trade-offs, judgments about opportunity costs and so on and so forth. And I'm talking about that not just in economic terms, but in human, social terms as well. Nevertheless, there is, I think, a viable exit strategy that should be pursued. And it is an exit strategy which is sometimes referred to as segment and shield. And this has been studied. There has been a paper released by a number of academics, so-called experts in the field, and they have come up with some pretty good evidence to suggest that the segment and shield approach is the most viable. The paper is called Segmentation and Shielding of the Most Vulnerable Members of the Population as Elements of an Exit Strategy from COVID-19 Lockdown. So if you type that into Google, you'll find the paper. It is a working paper, and I believe at this point it still hasn't been peer-reviewed, as is the case with many of the papers that are being published on COVID-19. In any case, the authors, there are a number of authors to the paper. I don't have their names in front of me at the moment, but they come from a number of different research institutes and university departments. So, for example, the Department of Medicine, the Division of Infectious Diseases, Imperial College London, UK, Centre for Mathematical Modelling of Infectious Disease, London, School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, London, UK, the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Edinburgh, Clinical Infection Research Group, Regional Infectious Diseases Unit, Western General Hospital, UK. So it's a serious paper from people who are, it seems, well qualified to comment on this. And they have proposed the segment and shield approach as the most viable approach to exiting from the lockdowns in the absence of a vaccine or a viable treatment for the virus. So let me just explain very briefly what a segment and shield approach would look like or could look like. Now, this is my own kind of rendition on the segment and shield approach. It's broadly in line with what's outlined in that paper, but I've added my own little twists to it because I think these are probably the most viable politically. So the segment and shield approach involves legally enforcing a lockdown on all those with pre-existing chronic health conditions and or over the age of 70. That is to say, those in the overwhelmingly most at-risk groups, during an extended period of, say, 2 to 3 months initially. I would probably include in that pre-existing chronic health conditions group, regardless of age, people who are significantly obese. It does seem that people who are significantly obese are at a much higher risk of suffering from a severe or critical version of the virus. So you ensure that such people, the vulnerable, those people who are over the age of 70 and those with pre-existing chronic health conditions, ensure that they're adequately provided for in terms of medical supplies, home care, food deliveries, all in strict compliance with the most rigorous hygiene standards. So you ensure consistent testing of relevant care workers, people who are delivering, in addition to robust personal protection equipment supplies for all of those people. For the remainder of the population, the less vulnerable groups, allow all to return to work immediately in all sectors, allow all to return to their lives in every other way as normal. Encourage, of course, voluntary compliance among the less vulnerable population with consistent hand hygiene and social distancing where practical. Okay, so not actually enforcing social distancing protocols on businesses or restaurants or whatever it may be, but encouraging it where it's practical. During this through 2 to 3 month period, a considerable percentage of the less vulnerable will become infected in a relatively controlled manner. Though some hospitalizations will, of course, still occur among that cohort, amongst the less vulnerable, it will be in much, much lower numbers. So we'll achieve that curve flattening that was talked about initially as a justification for the lockdown, such that the healthcare system will be able to cope. In that period, you ramp up intensive care units capacities, medical capacity in general to deal with the virus. After the 2 to 3 month period, you begin easing the enforced lockdown on the vulnerable groups. They can now re-enter society where a large percentage of the non-vulnerable will already have been infected and will have built up a collective, more or less medium-term immunity by all accounts based on the most recent evidence. The vulnerable are at that point much less likely then to be infected by any random member of the public. And those vulnerable who do still get infected will be better handled by the ramped up healthcare systems by that point. And then over the following couple of months, even more robust collective immunity will gradually be achieved until such time as a vaccine becomes available. So that is a kind of outline of the approach that I favour, the segment and shield approach. It has the benefit of focusing very systematically on the most vulnerable groups, which is what we should be doing, protecting those vulnerable groups as much as possible until such a time as we have viable treatments or a vaccine, without actually decimating completely the economy, without crippling sectors such as hospitality, restaurants, bars and so on, which will have huge, significant economic knock-on effects and all of the unemployment that it entails. Now, I'm not saying it's a perfect solution. I'm not saying that it's necessarily easy to enforce, but then complete lockdowns are no less easy to enforce either. And I'm not suggesting that there won't still be some young people or people in the less vulnerable groups who suffer critical illness or maybe even suffer fatal illness from the virus. That is still possible, of course, but much, much lower rates, significantly lower rates than the vulnerable groups, and indeed, I would say, of comparable risk to other daily risks that we willingly assume in our day-to-day lives as members of those less vulnerable populations. I'll come back to that point a little bit later on, but I think that is a very, very important point that can't be understated. So that's the viable exit strategy as I see it. Let's contrast that with where we are now. So the situation at present is that most governments, Western governments in particular, seem to be converging towards a situation where they are now beginning to slowly lift the lockdowns in a phased manner, and movement to the next phase of lifting of the lockdown is conditional on the infection rate being kept below a certain point. So there's a fixation now on the R0 number, and governments seem to be suggesting that if the R0 rises significantly above 1, that we will need to reintroduce lockdown measures. So this strikes me as a completely absurd situation and not an exit strategy at all, but really just a cop-out, because what it really means is that we'll never get out of the lockdown until we have a vaccine. The reality is, and I think everyone knows this, and politicians, I think, deep down know this, the reality is that if we lift the lockdown, a second wave of the virus is inevitable. suppression is completely fantasy at this point. There's no hope whatsoever of suppressing the virus permanently, that is to say, destroying it, getting it out of society. And anyone who suggests that it is possible is, I would suggest, living in a fantasy land. And there's no scientific basis for the supposition that we can suppress this virus successfully without a vaccine. So we have the virus out there. It's already out there amongst a population of millions of people in any given country. Even if you get the infection rate virtually down to zero, the virus is going to re-emerge eventually, because it's out there. It's on surfaces. There are people who are asymptomatic who never got tested. They're going to be walking around. They're going to infect other people, and that's going to happen eventually, no matter how slowly you lift the lockdown. So this idea of tiptoeing back into normality, and if we tiptoe slow enough, then the virus won't come back, is completely ridiculous. The virus will come back in a second wave. Slowly lifting may marginally delay, but not significantly delay the second wave. So a second wave is going to come, which begs the question, what's the point in having a phased approach at all if we're just going to have to return back into lockdown as soon as the infection rate rises significantly above an R0 of 1? We're going to have to go back into lockdown when the second wave comes, at least based on what governments are currently saying in Western nations. In other words, we're facing a situation where we're going to have cycles of lockdowns until such time as we have a vaccine, because if the second wave comes after the first lifting of the lockdown, the third wave is going to come after the second lifting of a lockdown, and the fourth after a third lifting of the lockdown, and so on and so forth indefinitely. So that's the situation we are now, the absurd situation that we're facing into. The economic consequences of this collectively, of several prominent nations pursuing this kind of approach at the same time, is going to absolutely be catastrophic. I don't think I can overstate this. I'm not given to hyperbole normally, but we're looking at something that is totally unprecedented in modern history. The first 2 or so months of lockdown, the economic fallout from that is going to be bad enough. Most serious economic research institutes now seem to be suggesting that this is going to have an impact that's comparable in magnitude to the economic depression of the 1930s. And that's just from the first 2 months of total lockdown in many countries. But add to that the fact that the lifting is looking very, very piecemeal and gradual, and is likely to continue to have a very, very devastating effect on demand in sectors such as hospitality, restaurants, tourism, and so on and so forth, and all the knock-on effects of that. But not only that, add that to that the prospect of having to lock down again, which I suggest is inevitable on the current set of policies. Locking down again for another 2 months after, say, a month of trying to lift the lockdown. When that happens, we're not just talking about an additive effect. We're talking about a compound effect. In other words, it's not a case of adding 2 months of lockdown, effective 2 months of lockdown plus 2 months of lockdown. We're talking about having an initial 2 months of lockdown absolutely devastating the economy, lifting the lockdown slightly, and then just as the economy is about to restart, enforcing the lockdown again on an economy that's already been battered. So we'll have 2 months of battering an already battered economy, and doing that in cycles indefinitely until we have a vaccine, it seems, based on the fact that this is the only proposal that governments have come out with. That's insane. That is absolutely insane. If the current effect of the first 2 months of lockdown is on the magnitude of the economic depression from the 1930s, what's it going to be like after 5, 6, 7 cycles of such lockdowns? It's almost unimaginable how wide-ranging this is going to be. Now, I'm talking about economic consequences, but I think economic consequences are humanitarian consequences eventually. So this idea that there's a dichotomy between health and economy is utterly ridiculous. People go on committing this fallacy over and over again. People on the left like to suggest that anyone who is skeptical of lockdowns is only concerned about profit, finance, big business, and so on and so forth, which is obviously utter horseshit. That is complete strawman of the position, especially when one considers that economic health translates eventually into actual health, human health, and it also translates into political health. So if the economy collapses, and it will collapse if we go into a second lockdown, utterly collapse because of the uncertainty, because of people resigning themselves to this going on indefinitely, and what that will do to investment, what that will do to every business essentially in the economy is going to be catastrophic. So it will lead to an economic collapse. When that happens, all of the government's revenues dry up, of course, because the government lives on revenue, lives on tax revenue from the private sector. Without that coming in, governments have nothing apart from printing money. So they'll start printing money, which will devalue and debase the currency significantly. And then we get hyperinflation eventually. And we've seen what that leads to in places like Venezuela and Zimbabwe. But not only that, when the private sector collapses and the government's funding collapses, the healthcare system collapses. Okay, so most healthcare systems around the world are primarily publicly funded in some way or another. So what happens when the private sector collapses is eventually the healthcare system collapses. And that's not just bad news for COVID-19, it's bad news for every single other cause of death, mortality. So that has to be factored in. So that's one aspect of the economic consequences being far, far more important than simply worrying about businesses and profits. But also there's the fact that we're talking about the economic impacts on developing nations. So of course, most developing nations are heavily dependent on the economic fortunes of developed countries, because of course most of them tend to be export-based economies. And if the Western economy so-called collapses, then that's going to have very dire consequences for the less developed nations, developing nations that rely heavily on exports. Now, I was doing some research on this recently on the effect of economic recessions on mortality, and my initial assumption, as I think most people's assumptions would be that economic recessions have a negative impact on mortality rates overall. Actually, what I found was quite surprising, initially at least, a counterintuitive result is that economic recessions, I should say, in developed nations in particular, actually lower the overall mortality rate in the population. But if you think about it for a while, it actually isn't all that surprising, because when a huge number of people become unemployed and they're staying at home, they're not going out as much, not traveling as much, there's less scope for accidental deaths to occur, and accidental deaths account for a huge proportion of overall deaths, especially things like traffic accidents, road accidents, workplace accidents. All of these go far down in an economic recession, these causes of death. And so the overall death rate actually ends up going down in economic recessions in developed countries. Now, initially I was thinking that this might actually be a strong argument in favour of maintaining the lockdowns, because you could argue that it's actually going to lead to lower death rates overall, not just from COVID-19. But then I looked into it a bit more and I dug a little bit deeper, and I discovered that they did a study in Brazil on the effects of the economic recession that happened there at the beginning of the last decade. And they discovered that in fact there the overall mortality rate went up as a result of the economic recession. And part of the conclusion is that poorer nations suffer significantly more from economic recessions, unsurprisingly, and in terms of mortality rates, the outcomes are much worse, which again shouldn't surprise us considering the number of poor people in those countries and the people who are living on the margins of absolute poverty, not just relative poverty, but absolute poverty in such countries. An economic recession for them can mean the difference between life and death, quite literally. It can mean the difference between being able to feed their kids and not being able to feed their kids. So that is what we're dealing with when it comes to the effect of an economic recession on developing countries. But that's economic recessions. What we're facing into, according to most recent analyses, economic analyses, is depression. And not just an economic depression globally, but an economic depression the likes of which we've never seen. So if the effect of an economic recession in a country like Brazil is to raise the overall mortality rate. One can imagine what the effect of a global, deeper than we've ever experienced economic depression will be on those kinds of countries. I also suspect that the findings from economic recessions in developed nations would be different from the effect of a deep, long-lasting economic depression in such nations in terms of the effects on overall mortality rates. Now, I should say that the mortality rates from certain causes of death, such as, for example, suicide, shoot right up under economic recessions in developed countries, and that's not surprising. Likewise, in developing nations. So again, one can imagine that that is going to be substantially higher in an economic depression, the likes of which we've never seen in history. And again, the same goes for developing nations. But I'm more concerned about the effect that this is going to have on developing nations in terms of pushing people back into absolute poverty and consigning who knows how many millions of people to premature deaths as a result. And that is not trivial. That is very, very significant from an ethical point of view, and that needs to be factored in. I would suggest that what we're doing is certainly moving towards a situation where the cure will end up being worse than the disease. Now, this is not comparing the current approach, which we are apparently sleepwalking into, with a do-nothing approach. So I'm not advocating a do-nothing approach. Remember, I'm talking about a segment and shield approach. Certainly a do-nothing approach with respect to COVID-19 is likely to lead to millions of deaths worldwide. And so one might argue, well, enforcing cycles of lockdown, yes, it's going to lead to a global economic depression until we have a vaccine, and perhaps cause millions of deaths, but it will be slightly less millions of deaths than would be caused by a do-nothing approach and allowing COVID-19 to just spread uncontrolled throughout the global population. But again, that's a false dichotomy. It's not a case of choosing between what we're currently pursuing and do nothing. There are middle ground approaches which I'm suggesting, one of which I'm suggesting, the segment and shield approach, strikes me as the most practical and the one that is most likely to be able to be pursued by most countries regardless of their level of wealth. So talking about things like test and trace, rigorous testing and tracing of the entire population, for example, that's all well and good if you are a considerably wealthy country. So South Korea, for example, is a very wealthy country indeed, and they have a very strong healthcare system. And that's fine. That's all well and good for such a country. But for developing nations, pursuing anything like that is just not on the table. We have to be realistic about that. And so I think the segment and shield approach is a much more viable alternative for such countries. But I think it's even a more viable alternative for countries in the West as well. And I think it's more viable than testing and tracing in terms of its long-term application and its possibility of it getting us to a point where we have something like collective immunity and a robust population that is not economically crippled. So the economic consequences, they cannot be gainsaid. This cannot be dismissed as trivial or cynical concern for the economy. The economy is health. The economy is livelihoods. The economy is, for developing nations, the difference between life and death, the difference between being able to feed your child and not. And the fortunes of Western economies are fundamentally, inextricably tied up with the fortunes of developing nations. And that cannot be dismissed out of hand without being intellectually dishonest and disingenuous. So I'm very concerned about that. And I think that needs to be factored in to any analysis of a morally supportable set of policies. And I would suggest that what we're facing into now, what we're pursuing now, is not morally supportable, especially when there is a much more potentially viable, less harmful, humanitarianly harmful policy option on the table. I want to talk as well a little bit about the political implications of all this in terms of what I'm going to call authoritarian creep. Now, again, I don't pay any heed to conspiracy theorists. I don't pay any heed to people who are suggesting that this was some kind of covert, planned pandemic in an attempt to gain more political power and control for certain groups. I think that's manifestly absurd. So when I'm talking about the authoritarian creep, I don't mean to give any credence to such theories, but I think there is certainly an element of this that we should be worried about as governments arrogate to themselves more centralised power and authority in an effort to enforce lockdowns. I do worry significantly about what this is going to mean further down the road. Again, I don't think this is the most important consideration from a moral point of view, and I don't necessarily think that we're going to end up in a situation where Western governments are suddenly Soviet unions overnight. We're not going to have the Gestapo, we're not going to have that kind of thing, I think, in any short-term sense. But I do worry still about the creep towards authoritarianism, political authoritarianism, that this could precipitate. And the reason is because of the trends I've seen in the public discussion about COVID-19. I've seen people becoming increasingly moralistic towards their neighbours, towards other people, engaging in a kind of vigilantism in terms of surveilling and socially policing other people, browbeating them, accusing them of being complicit in the deaths of people because they engage in relatively innocuous behaviours, such as being on their own in the park longer than they should be or something like that. So I'm concerned about that creeping in, that kind of attitude, that kind of resentment. But it's more, it seems to me, common, at least initially, this kind of attitude is becoming more common on the left. This kind of authoritarian impulse to support heavy crackdowns on people who are perceived to be bending the rules or who are not complying as people would wish. Now, I'm not talking about the ridiculous protests, for example, in the United States, where we have so-called conservatives, Republican protesters, many of whom seem to be wealthy people, privileged people, going out with their guns, waving their American flags, storming state legislatures and things like that, and being generally ridiculous, getting up in arms because they can't get their haircuts, or they can't go to get their manicures or whatever it may be. They're manifestly ridiculous people, and many of them are actually putting people at risk with their behaviour, and they should be condemned, rightly so, for that. However, there is a trend towards this kind of demonisation of much more innocuous and innocent behaviours, which are objectively not putting anyone at risk, and yet people are willing to come down quite hard on such behaviours and people. And it seems to me that that is what's creating the conditions and an environment in which government heavy-handedness is more likely to go uncriticised and to be accepted and to become normalised gradually over time. And in an environment where increasingly many people believe that heavy-handed clamping down on errant behaviour is righteous, is justified because of the ends that it serves, when you get to that point, I think you create the conditions for government propaganda and government rationalisation of human rights abuses. Now, I don't think we're necessarily at that point yet, but I can see the roots of this kind of taking hold, this mentality. And we've gotten to a point now where the discussion has become so unnuanced and so oversimplified that you are either for the lockdown or against it. And many people seem to think that if you are for the lockdown, you're morally upstanding. And if you're against the lockdown or sceptical of the lockdown, you must be in some way morally perverse, suspect, or wish death upon vulnerable people, which of course is totally absurd and ridiculous. But that's kind of how simplified and polarised this has become. It's very frustrating to see that. And again, that kind of polarisation, I think, only feeds into the risk of authoritarian creep. So that's another concern that I have about where we're going. I fear that in 2-3 months, as people become resigned to this kind of political surveilling, policing, micromanaging of people's lives, as people become resigned to that, that governments will take advantage of that. And I think fatigue, in a way, is one of the dangers here. Political fatigue setting in amongst government agencies, for example, and things just become automatic, and it just becomes automatic to force people to stay inside. It becomes automatic to come down in a heavy-handed manner on someone who's not wearing a mask in a public place, or it becomes the norm. It becomes automatic. And it's when things like that become automatic that it gets really dangerous, because then it just becomes the norm, and people just become resigned to it. And before you know it, you're living in a political climate that is just totally foreign, but something that we wouldn't even have dreamed of allowing to happen just a year ago or 2 years ago. But suddenly we wake to find ourselves in that kind of situation because of kind of complacency, because of a tendency to give the moral benefit of the doubt to heavy-handedness in enforcing lockdown rules. So I foresee that potentially happening, and it's very worrying indeed. So that's another aspect of this, another potential cost of human cost of pursuing the strategy we're now pursuing. So the next question is how and why we got to this point, where this strategy that we've converged on, this so-called exit strategy of piecemeal lifting of lockdown, but what's ultimately going to be inevitable moving back into lockdown because of the second wave, the inevitability of a second wave. How do we get to this point? I think it has a lot to do with, well, there are two main factors, I think, especially in the context of Northern Europe and places like the UK and Ireland, but that seems to have spread elsewhere in terms of this kind of rationale. There are two factors. The first is that the initial justification for the lockdowns, which was flattening the curve, which was perfectly understandable and legitimate, has slowly modulated into a different kind of ethic, a different kind of rationale, which is what I call the death avoidance ethic. So keeping the infection rate down as much as possible initially was understandable in light of what happened in Italy, but also it's legitimate simply to maintain the healthcare system, to prevent it from collapsing. And so keeping the flattening the curve was totally understandable as a justification for the lockdowns when there was so much uncertainty about what was happening. And people initially seemed to get on board with that. It was ubiquitous. We saw the appeal to curve flattening everywhere on the internet, and people supporting the lockdown as a means to achieving a flattening of the curve. But as the weeks wore on, I noticed that in people's discussions of this, it shifted from curve flattening to death avoidance, avoiding deaths from COVID-19. And I can understand why people would shift to that kind of appeal, because it's more, at least on the surface, it's more ethically forceful. We need to do this because we have to prevent deaths from COVID-19. We need to stop people dying. And that has a moral force that curve flattening maybe doesn't have after a certain amount of time. But the problem is that we now have backed ourselves into a corner with this death avoidance ethic, because any move away from lockdown, any move, inevitably, and everyone seems to accept this, even those supporting the lockdowns, any move from lockdown is going to lead to more deaths, because the infection rate will go up. And when the infection rate goes up, you increase the probability that more people will die from the disease. So the people who have shifted to this death avoidance ethic have unwittingly, I would suggest, backed themselves and governments into an impossible corner, one that is impossible to get out of. Because if your metric now of justification for government policy is that it avoids any excess deaths from COVID-19, if that's your metric, then the only viable option until a vaccine becomes available is to maintain an indefinite lockdown. And that, I suggest, is completely absurd. But not only is it absurd, it is morally bankrupt when one thinks about it for more than a moment. So the death avoidance ethic has a very superficial appeal, but it is, I would suggest, completely unjustifiable. And it is, if you reflect on it for a moment in terms of your previous behaviour. in terms of how you behaved and conducted yourself before this pandemic occurred. Every person, including those now saying that any death from COVID-19 is unacceptable, or any excess death from COVID-19 is unacceptable, people are saying that. Those self-same people before the pandemic demonstrated by their actions that they didn't actually believe that that was a legitimate position to hold, simply in virtue of the fact that they left their house every day. So anytime a person leaves their house, commutes to work, interacts with other people, and so on and so forth in their day-to-day lives, they increase the chances of causing another person to die from an accidental death just by virtue of interacting with them, or they also increase their own chances of death significantly when they leave their house. Now, if they believe that avoidance of death is an absolute ethic, that it is that all other ethical concerns are subordinate to death avoidance, if they really believed that, then they would never leave their house in their normal lives. They would never do so because it puts other people's lives at risk and it puts their own lives at risk. Now, you might say, well, it's a trivial risk that they submit other people to. Well, that's not actually true when you think about it collectively. So the probability that I will die a premature death as a result of everyone else going out in public every day is significantly greater than it would be if no one left their houses. So that's what we're dealing with. We're not talking about just on the individual level, we're talking about it on a collective level, and that's what we're talking about with COVID-19 as well. And that's precisely why people think that the death avoidance ethic is applicable in this case. They say we need to maintain the lockdown, not because the risk is significantly increased if any one individual goes out into the public, but it's significantly increased when everyone goes out in the public together. And that's what we want to avoid. But the problem is that we've always been doing this, and every time we go out in public, we're significantly increasing the risk of death to other people. So, for example, by travelling in a car, driving a car, but just by interacting with people in a bar or a pub or restaurant on any given day, speaking with them, you're exposing them to potentially a virus that you're not aware of, or some other infection that you're not aware that you even have. They could go on to pass it on to someone who's vulnerable or immunocompromised and so on. All of these things are daily risks that we submit other people to and that we submit ourselves to. And yet we don't lock ourselves down indefinitely under our normal circumstances. So the question is, why don't we do that? And we don't do that because we recognise that living a life like that would be nightmarish. Living a life where the only moral, the only ethic is death avoidance, living that kind of life would be hellish. It wouldn't be a life that's worth living, because we would be consigned to our houses for the rest of our lives. We wouldn't interact with anyone. We wouldn't leave for work. We would all work remotely. We would not leave our houses for exercise, because who knows what would happen if you leave your house for exercise. We'd all do our exercises in our houses. We would ban cigarettes. We would ban alcohol. We would ban any kind of unhealthy food. We would ensure that everyone eats a regimented diet according to the best nutritional guidelines, and so on and so forth. We could do that. We could design our society in such a way that death avoidance was the only relevant or the ultimate metric, the ultimate ethical value. But we know that we don't want to live in that society, and it would be a nightmare. Quality of life, the content of life, is ethically very relevant and is not trivial. It's not something that is self-evidently subordinate to death avoidance at all costs. And so we need to factor that into our analysis as well. And doing so is not callous. It's not a death wish for the vulnerable. It's utter horseshit if you say that, because then you have to explain why you don't maintain that same ethic in every other aspect of your life prior to the pandemic, why you didn't behave that way with respect to everything else, and why you would not behave that way indefinitely, regardless of whether or not we get a vaccine to this particular virus. Because if that is really your ethic, then you will apply it in every other domain of your life as well. And you'll sit at home for the rest of your life and you'll do absolutely fucking nothing that would put anyone at risk, ever. Of course, that's ridiculous and absurd. So the content of life is not something that is trivial or can be dismissed out of hand, and it should be factored into the moral calculus in this situation. So again, you have to explain. There's a burden on you if you're one of these people who says that lifting the lockdown is unacceptable until we have a vaccine. If you're that kind of person, then you have to explain why you don't hold the same ethic or apply the same ethic in those other areas. Why do you not, for example, advocate for the banning of all cars? Because, of course, a huge cause of accidental deaths every year is traffic, whether to pedestrians or other car drivers or whatever it may be. Now, a lot of people would say to that, oh, well, that's not a good analogy. It's not a fair analogy. They're totally different things. This is a virus we're talking about. And it's like, well, okay, if that's your response, then you don't really understand how analogies are supposed to work. They don't have to be the same. Okay, the point is that there are structural similarities there. And the structural similarity in this case is pertaining to risk assessment, risk analysis. So, for example, when I go out in my car and drive around, I'm exposing other people to risk. I'm also exposing myself to risk, okay? So that's where the structural parallel is with respect to the virus. When I go out now in the context of COVID-19, I pose a marginal risk to myself because I happen to be in a non-vulnerable group, but I pose a significant, or at least more significant risk to vulnerable people, okay? Assuming we do nothing and we just return to normal, that would be a situation where I would be posing a risk to vulnerable people. Now, I'm not suggesting we go back to normal instantly, because I do think it would be an unreasonable risk, because it could be avoided effectively by pursuing a segment and shield approach until we have a vaccine or a viable treatment. Nevertheless, the analogy is a legitimate one. It's not illegitimate to raise the point about car accidents. We could avoid car accidents completely by banning cars or reducing the speed limit to 5 kilometers per hour. But we don't do that because we recognize that it is absurd to suggest something like that. We recognize that quality of life's considerations factor into this as well. So that's the burden that's on the person who is paying lip service, I would suggest, to this death avoidance ethic. They need to explain why they don't do that, apply that in all these other cases, all these other causes of premature death. So, for example, there's a 1 in 3,000 chance of people below the age of 40 with no underlying health conditions dying from the virus. Currently, it seems that's the latest estimate. 1 in 3,000 chance. There's a 1 in 103 chance in any given year that you will die from a car accident, and a 1 in 700 chance that anyone below the age of 35 will die from sudden adult death syndrome, okay, over a 20-year period, for example. Now, I know the time frames here are a little bit messy and they don't map perfectly onto each other, but the point is that there are other risks, death risks, that we assume. And even people in the non-vulnerable category assume death risks much, much more significant every day than the death risk from COVID-19. And the risk that they pose to other people in vulnerable groups, for example, by doing everyday activities like driving cars, for example, are significant and higher than the death risk posed by COVID-19. So I'm not saying by making this point that COVID-19 risks are trivial, and I'm not saying that they don't warrant a certain political response. They do, and the response I suggest as being most viable in this case is segmentation and shielding. But it does raise the question as to why our risk assessment has gone so haywire in this situation, why it's gone completely off the rails in the case of COVID-19. Is it simply in virtue of the fact that this is a new and novel threat, and because of that, because of availability bias, we have completely inflated the relative risk profile of the disease as a result? It kind of reminds me of the situation where, for example, you have terrorist attacks. In the wake of terrorist attacks, people tend to grossly overestimate the risk of dying from terrorism. It seems to me that a similar kind of psychological dynamic is at play currently, albeit that the death risk from COVID-19 obviously is higher than terrorism. Again, my point isn't to say that it is comparable, but my point is to draw attention to the psychological dynamics that are underpinning this gross misassessment of risk in the case of COVID-19. So we need to figure that out. We need to drop this ridiculous death avoidance ethic that has now become the standard for many people, and which necessarily backs us into a corner that it is impossible to get out of until we have a vaccine, which again is no guarantee. There's no guarantee that we're going to get a vaccine. We're hopeful that we'll get a vaccine in 18 months or 2 years. But if even that is the case, cycles of lockdown until that point, as I suggested earlier, are an utter fucking catastrophe and likely to consign millions and millions of people to death in the developing world, but also to immiseration, poverty, and all sorts of mental anguish and suffering, joblessness, and so on, which are also morally relevant and have to be factored in. The other point I want to make is that the reason we've gotten to this point is not just the emergence of this misplaced death avoidance ethic, but also early on, especially in the UK, discussion about this. The herd immunity idea became vilified, and unjustifiably so, I think, because of political motivation, because of ideological motivation. So what happened was, initially, it seemed the UK was moving in the direction of simply making voluntary guidances and guidelines, not enforcing any kind of lockdown. But they did seem to be moving towards recommending, or strongly recommending, that people over the age of 70 or with pre-existing health conditions isolated themselves for an extended period. Now, this became conflated then with the idea of herd immunity, because herd immunity was suggested as one possible justification for this kind of approach. And people jumped on the idea of herd immunity, and I think maybe because it had a kind of a pseudoscientific ring to it. It sounded kind of like pop science. And so people jumped on it, and they claimed that this was the rationale behind Boris Johnson's initial move towards that kind of policy. And obviously because of the backlash, the political pressure, and especially because of the Imperial College London paper, which has since actually been scrutinised, and there are strong reasons to believe that it is defective for various reasons in terms of the modelling. But I'll set that to one side. Regardless of that, because of that backlash in the paper, people's negative reaction to the rhetorical negative reaction to the idea of herd immunity, Boris Johnson capitulated and they shifted to a lockdown approach, as did most of the countries in Europe. So it seems to me what's happened is herd immunity has now become conflated with a do-nothing approach. And that is ridiculous, because they're not one and the same thing. Herd immunity can be achieved via various policy means. Various avenues can take us to a situation of herd immunity. One of them, of course, is vaccination. But there are other ways of getting there as well. And I would suggest segment and shield is one plausible way of getting there. But herd immunity is a scientifically valid, perfectly legitimate concept. There's nothing inherently suspect about it, and it's something that we desire to get to. We want to get to a situation of herd immunity for this particular virus. Now, again, people are using the uncertainty about the immunity dynamics of COVID-19, the COVID-19 virus, as a justification for skepticism about the viability of herd immunity in this context. But that, as I suggested earlier, has since been resolved, and we have every reason to believe that one can become significantly immune post-infection, having recovered from the coronavirus. So herd immunity is back on the table, and in fact never really was off the table, because of course vaccines are supposed to induce herd immunity as well, and people assumed that a vaccine was possible. So this herd immunity idea became conflated, unjustifiably so, with a do-nothing approach. But herd immunity is what we need to aim for. And the problem was that when this conflation occurred early on in that discussion, and it became associated in people's minds, and especially in people who were averse to, who were critics of Boris Johnson and the Tories, in their minds, herd immunity became associated with the Tories, and therefore anything that mentioned, or any policy that mentioned herd immunity, was immediately off the table as a result. Which again is totally fucking ridiculous, but that's how people's minds work when it comes to politics. Guilt by association. So herd immunity became tarnished by association with Boris Johnson and the Tories, and therefore it was off the table. And any kind of policy with respect to COVID-19 that entailed or incorporated or mentioned herd immunity was immediately dismissed and vilified. And the problem is, of course, that the segment and shield approach, part of its appeal is that it does have an avenue or route to herd immunity built into it in a way that total lockdown doesn't, or cycles of lockdown, or tiptoeing out of lockdown doesn't. It doesn't have any method or means of achieving herd immunity built into it. It simply states that the current approach simply states that if the infection rate goes above a certain point, above 1 in terms of the R0, then we shut down again, which doesn't allow for herd immunity to develop at all. It just means we're going to have a vulnerable population, a non-immune population, indefinitely until we have a vaccine, which is totally insane and ridiculous. So herd immunity has to be on the table, I suggest. It has to be back on the table. And people who are averse to the Tories, people who are on the left, need to shake this utterly fucking ridiculous idea that herd immunity is equal to or equivalent to do nothing, or herd immunity is an inherently right-wing idea. It's not. You fucking idiots, get it out of your heads. So that is another reason why we've gotten to this point. This is why we've gotten to a situation where people are apparently nodding along with the current set of policies proposed by most Western governments. So that brings me then to the final point I want to discuss, which is the politicisation of the pandemic. And this has been pretty despairing and exasperating. We've seen a tendency of people to assume that anyone who's sceptical of the lockdown approach and the tiptoe out of lockdown so-called exit strategies that have been converged towards, anyone sceptical of this is immediately assumed to be a right-wing nutjob who just wants everything to go back to normal immediately and who has no concern for the vulnerable, which is total nonsense, of course, but that's where we're at now. Another really frustrating aspect of this is the political opportunism that I've seen on display. So it seems to me that people are using this crisis, taking advantage of this crisis with the intent of shoehorning in their favoured ideological positions. So I've heard people saying that, for example, we can't go back to the normal. We can't go back to normal. Normal was the problem in the first place. We can't go back to normal because normal was a horrible socioeconomic system, and we can't go back to the capitalist status quo and so on and so forth. We need to take this as an opportunity to introduce all sorts of measures, which of course have virtually nothing to do with COVID-19. So we're hearing people talking about how this is an opportunity now to implement the Green New Deal of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and her ilk. And this is an opportunity to address climate change as well at the same time, or something like that. It's like, what are you fucking talking about, you absolute nutter? Like, this is insanity. If you think this is the perfect time to do that kind of thing, you're utterly insane. So let's take another analogy. Let's imagine that you are on a boat and you are very dissatisfied with the boat. You think it's a very suboptimal boat, could have been built much better. But in any case, you're already on the ship or boat or whatever it may be. Let's say ship. And you're with a number of other people on the ship and you're sailing through the seas, and in the middle of the ocean you run into a huge storm. And the boat starts leaking. So there's a hole in the ship. And at this point you say to your shipmates, now is the time for us to create the perfect ship. Now is the perfect opportunity for us to create our perfect vision of what a ship should be. Okay, let's get started. Obviously your shipmates would look at you like you're a fucking lunatic. And they would insist that you have absolutely nothing to do with resolving the situation. At that point, the only thing that should be done is to fix the hole in the ship and to get back to shore as quickly as possible. Once you get back to shore, you can talk about your utopian ship. But in the meantime, getting back to quote-unquote normality is absolutely the moral priority. And indulging your vision of the perfect society or your ideological proclivities at this point is not just idiotic, but it's morally repugnant, self-indulgent. Because the chances that you're going to be able to build your perfect ship in the middle of a fucking storm when there's a hole in the boat is zero. And that's the situation that we're currently in. The world economy is at sea in the middle of a storm and there's a hole in the boat. And there are people seriously suggesting that we reconstruct the entire fucking boat from the ground up in the vision of their utopia. You have to be out of your fucking mind to think that that's a good idea. So I would suggest, if you're one of those people, that you keep your mouth shut. Okay. I think I'll stop there, because otherwise I'll just get angry and start throwing my laptop off the wall. So I hope you'll consider some of the things that I've been saying. Feel free to share this video around. I think that common sense and logic recommends that we reconsider a segmenting and shielding approach as a viable exit strategy, and that talk of herd immunity needs to be back on the table. So yeah, thanks for listening. Take care.